In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, the ideology that had driven half the globe seemed to vanish overnight. For most observers, capitalism had one history, and Karl Marx was safely buried beneath the rubble of the Berlin Wall. Yet, less than 2 decades later, the global financial system fractured. During the 2008 crash, as banks failed and governments scrambled to bail out billionaires, sales of Marx's masterwork, Das Kapital, suddenly spiked by 400%. Today, we see a peculiar paradox. Wall Street hedge funds hire analysts to apply his economic models to predict market crises, while tech workers in Silicon Valley use his theories on labor to organize unions. To understand why a 19th century philosopher haunts our digital economy, we have to look past the authoritarian regimes of the 1900s. We have to go back to the beginning and meet the actual man who put capitalism on the autopsy table. In the 1840s, Karl Marx was a restless, exiled radical moving between European cities. Long before his face became a rigid state icon, he was a curious observer, obsessed with a single driving question: what if human labor didn't have to hurt? He found his answer, ironically, through the heir to a textile empire. Friedrich Engels was a young businessman managing his father's factories, and he arrived at a Parisian cafe armed with a manuscript full of hard data. Engels documented the visceral reality of the Manchester mills. He laid out the physical destruction of the working class, recording how children worked 16-hour shifts until their spines curved, while families traded their dignity for pennies to survive. Confronted with this evidence, the two men stripped away the polished surface of the Industrial Revolution. In 23 pages, they wrote the Communist Manifesto, arguing that the history of human society is driven entirely by the struggle between opposing economic classes. Their collaboration was an attempt to scientifically diagnose a system that treated living human beings as disposable parts within a giant grinding machine. By the 1850s, Marx was living in desperate poverty in London. While 3 of his children died from malnutrition and disease, he spent his days trudging through the fog to the British Museum reading room, obsessively tracking factory reports and dry economic data. Those decades of research culminated in his masterwork, Das Kapital. In it, he laid out the central mechanics of capitalism, defining it as a brutal alchemy. The system, he argued, survives only by converting living human sweat and time into dead, accumulated wealth. His core theory: surplus value. Workers produce economic value, but owners pay them a fraction in wages, pocketing the remainder as profit. This endless extraction means workers can't afford their goods, leading directly to catastrophic boom-bust cycles. He believed he had mapped out a system that carried the seeds of its own destruction, a machine doomed to eventually collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Marx died in an armchair by his fire in 1883, his major theories left in chaotic, unfinished drafts. Yet the 20th century took those incomplete ideas and applied them with devastating, unintended consequences. His vague concept of a workers' democracy was weaponized. In backward agrarian nations like Russia, places Marx never expected to lead an industrial revolution, leaders invoked his name to justify the creation of brutal one-party states. Ironically, these regimes often mirrored the exact industrial nightmare Marx originally diagnosed. They became rigidly hierarchical systems, obsessed with relentless production targets and state quotas, heavily enforced at the expense of human life. History seemed to prove his predictions entirely wrong. He failed to anticipate how easily his critique could be corrupted into state tyranny, or how effectively the comforts of modern consumerism would pacify the working classes in the West. But if we strip away the heavy baggage of the Cold War and look closely at our modern digital economy, the old theorist stages a strange comeback. The grinding alienation of the Victorian factory floor looks remarkably similar to the life of an isolated gig worker today. Instead of a human foreman, labor is managed by a faceless app. Employees are timed during bathroom breaks by algorithms that don't need sleep, healthcare, or a living wage. Today's tech monopolies and automated management systems have perfected the math he scribbled down in the British Museum. They represent the ultimate frictionless realization of surplus value extraction, pulling wealth from a decentralized workforce with total efficiency. The 20th century proved that Marx's revolutionary solutions were deeply flawed, but his original 19th century diagnosis remains sharp. As long as economic inequality continues to widen, we are forced to ask the very questions he left behind. Who truly benefits from this system, and who pays the price?